A routine guardianship hearing took an unexpected turn when a 9-year-old girl stood up in court, pointed at the judge, and said, "You're my father." The entire courtroom fell silent. Judge Ethan Carter, a man known for his strict, no-nonsense demeanor, was left speechless. He had never seen this child before, or so he thought. Could this possibly be true? And if it was, would he accept her or walk away? Can you imagine being in his shoes? One moment, your life is predictable. The next, it's completely turned upside down. What would you do? Let's dive into this emotional journey together. And this is how it all began. The air inside the courtroom was thick with quiet murmurs and the rustling of papers. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, stretching long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The scent of old books, ink, and polished oak filled the air, a familiar combination in Judge Ethan Carter's courtroom. He struck the gavel once, sharp, decisive. The room fell into order. At 50, Judge Carter was a man of discipline, a man of the law. He had spent decades presiding over cases, from minor disputes to life-altering trials, and he had long since learned to keep his emotions locked away. The law was his guide, his shield, his truth. He didn't deal in sentiment, only facts, evidence, and hard decisions. Today was just another case, another child lost in the system. A guardianship hearing had been brought before him. The child, Lily Parker. A small, fragile-looking 9-year-old girl was led into the courtroom. She had wild curls framing her delicate face and wore a faded dress that seemed just a little too big for her thin frame. In her arms, she clutched a worn-out teddy bear, its fur flattened from years of being held too tightly. Ethan barely glanced at her as he flipped through the case file. He had seen too many cases like this before. A child shuffled from home to home, each one lasting just long enough for the attachment to form, then disappear. "Lily Parker," he read aloud, his voice steady, detached. "Currently in temporary state custody. No known relatives. Multiple unsuccessful foster placements." A sigh almost escaped him. "Your Honor," came the firm voice of Helen Foster, the social worker standing beside the girl. A seasoned veteran in child welfare, Helen had seen the system at its best and at its worst. She adjusted the papers in front of her. "Miss Parker has been moved between multiple foster homes over the past 2 years. Unfortunately, none have resulted in a permanent placement. Given the repeated instability and lack of viable guardians, we recommend that she be transferred to a state facility where she will receive structured long-term care." Helen's tone was professional, almost clinical. She wasn't cold, just tired. Ethan nodded, already expecting the outcome. He knew how these cases went. Children like Lily ended up in state facilities all the time. It wasn't ideal, but it was reality. Foster homes weren't always the answer, and some children just didn't fit. He glanced up, expecting to see the usual expression, numb acceptance, quiet resignation. But Lily wasn't looking at Helen, she was looking at him, and she wasn't just looking, she was staring. There was something unsettling in her gaze, not fear, not sadness, recognition. For the first time in years, something inside Ethan shifted. His fingers gripped the case file a little tighter. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to break the stare. It was nothing, just another child in the system. "Miss Parker," he said evenly, "do you understand why you're here today?" A standard question. He expected a hesitant nod, maybe a soft-spoken "yes, sir." But instead, Lily straightened her small shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor, but I don't need another foster home." Her voice was soft but clear. Ethan inhaled slowly, already preparing his response. He had heard this before. Some children wanted to go back to the life they once had. Some still hoped for their parents to return. It was normal. It was expected. But Lily wasn't finished. She took a deep breath, clutched her teddy bear a little tighter, and said the words that changed everything. "I already have a father, and he's standing right there." She lifted her chin and pointed straight at Ethan Carter. The entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. The rustling of papers ceased. The quiet murmurs died. For the first time in his life on the bench, Ethan Carter felt completely unprepared. His spine straightened, his jaw tightened, his grip on the file turned rigid. "Excuse me?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. Lily's gaze didn't waver. Her small hands gripped the teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping her steady, but her voice did not shake. "You're my dad." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. Helen Foster immediately stepped in. Your Honor, I assure you, this is a misunderstanding. Lily has been through a lot, and sometimes children. It's not a story. Lily's voice broke through, more desperate this time. She reached into her small backpack, fumbling for something. From inside, she pulled out a worn envelope, edges crumpled, yellowed with age. My mom wrote this before she died, she whispered. Her small hands trembled, but she held the letter tightly. She said, "You're my father." Ethan couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. For the first time in his entire career, he didn't know what to say. The courtroom faded into the background. His heart pounded in his ears. Slowly, mechanically, he motioned for the bailiff to take the letter. His hands felt unsteady as he reached for it. The handwriting on the front was faded, but it was unmistakable. It belonged to Emily Parker, a woman he had once loved, a woman he had lost, a woman who, according to the child standing before him, had kept a secret that changed everything. Ethan swallowed hard. His world had just tilted on its axis, and for the first time in years, he had no idea what to do next. The courtroom had never been so silent. Judge Ethan Carter sat rigidly in his chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. The weight of 1,000 cases had never felt as heavy as this moment. Across the room, Lily Parker stood with her small shoulders squared, her wide brown eyes locked onto his. She clutched a battered teddy bear, holding it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The weight of her tiny frame barely made an impression against the wooden chair, but her presence filled the entire room. The air was thick with anticipation. "Miss Parker," Ethan began, his voice steady but formal. "Do you understand the purpose of today's hearing?" A standard question, one he had asked countless times. Lily nodded, then took a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, "but I don't want to go to another foster home." A murmur ran through the gallery, barely noticeable but enough to make Helen Foster shift in her seat. Ethan exhaled slowly, already preparing his response. He had heard this before. Children clinging to the past, hoping for something that could no longer be. It was understandable, but it wouldn't change the court's decision. "Lily," he said evenly, "the court is here to ensure that you have a safe and stable environment. I already have a father." The words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan's grip tightened around the case file, his breath catching in his throat. Lily swallowed hard and took another deep breath, as if gathering every ounce of courage she had left. And he's standing right there. She lifted her chin and pointed directly at Ethan Carter. The entire courtroom froze. The soft murmur of side conversations vanished. The shuffling of papers ceased. Even the courtroom stenographer hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "Excuse me?" His voice came out sharper than intended. Lily flinched slightly, but she didn't back down. Her hands trembled, but her voice was unwavering. "You're my dad," she repeated. Ethan barely registered the gasps rippling through the room. This had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. A cruel trick of fate. Helen Foster immediately leaned forward, her professional demeanor slipping into something more urgent. "Your Honor, I assure you, this is a misunderstanding. Lily has been through a lot, and sometimes children." "It's not a story." Lily's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed forward. She let go of her teddy bear with one hand and reached into her backpack, fumbling for something inside. A crumpled envelope. She held it tightly, the edges worn and creased from being handled too many times. "My mom wrote this before she died," she said softly. Her small hands shook, but she held the letter out like it was her last hope. She said, "You're my father." Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For a long moment, the room didn't feel real. The bailiff stepped forward and took the envelope from Lily's trembling fingers, carefully walking it over to Ethan's bench. Ethan stared at it. The paper was yellowed with time. The ink on the front was slightly smudged, as if someone had held it too long with damp fingers. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Emily Parker. His throat went dry. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily, a woman from his past. A woman he had once loved and lost. A woman who, according to the child standing before him, had carried a secret that changed everything. His fingers hovered over the envelope, but he didn't open it. He couldn't. Not yet. His mind was reeling. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the weight in his chest told him otherwise. He looked back at Lily, who sat perfectly still, her wide brown eyes never leaving his. Waiting. Hoping. His world had just shifted, and for the first time in years, Judge Ethan Carter didn't know what to do. The heavy oak door to Judge Ethan Carter's chambers clicked shut behind him, sealing him in solitude. The room, once a place of order and certainty, now felt smaller, heavier, suffocating. His eyes fell on the envelope resting on his desk, aged, frayed at the edges, his name written across the front in familiar, delicate handwriting. Emily Parker. The name alone sent a sharp ache through his chest. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the envelope. How long had this letter been waiting for him? How many years had this truth been sealed inside, unheard, unread? His breath felt too shallow as he finally picked it up, feeling the weight of something far greater than paper. Slowly he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the words stared back at him, crisp and unrelenting. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it's time you knew the truth. His grip tightened around the page. A slow, uneasy breath left his lips. I never told you about Lily, not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of what it would do to your career. Afraid that if I told you, you'd feel trapped, or worse, that you'd feel obligated. His jaw clenched. Emily, always protecting him, even at her own expense, always making decisions for both of them. He could hear her voice as he read each word, could almost see her sitting across from him the way she used to, head tilted, eyes filled with something unreadable. But Lily deserves to know who her father is. She deserves a chance to be loved by you, and you deserve a chance to love her. His breath hitched. A chance? He had already missed 9 years. How do you make up for something like that? How do you step into a role you never knew you had, for a child who had spent her entire life without you? If you walk away from this, I won't blame you. But if there is even the smallest part of you that wonders, please, Ethan, don't let fear decide for you. His hands curled into fists. Fear. That's what this was, wasn't it? Not anger, not disbelief, not even the weight of responsibility. Fear. Fear of failing, fear of not being enough, fear that it was too late. The walls of his chambers felt closer now, as if the truth contained in that single page had swallowed all the air in the room. Emily was gone, but Lily was still here. And for the first time since stepping into the courtroom that morning, Ethan Carter wasn't sure if he could just walk away. The crisp autumn air bit at Ethan's skin as he stepped onto the quiet street. The city had settled into its late evening lull, the once busy sidewalks now sparse, the hum of passing cars fading into the distance. He barely noticed any of it. His mind was still trapped in the confines of his chambers, in the words scrawled across the worn letter in his pocket, in the face of a little girl who had looked at him with hope, a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. He wasn't sure how he had ended up here, only that his feet had carried him to the one place that made sense right now. A small, old-fashioned diner sat on the corner of the street, its neon sign flickering against the darkened sky. Inside, a man in his 60s sat at a booth near the window, nursing a cup of coffee, his silver hair catching the dim light. Daniel Reed. A former judge, a mentor, and, for better or worse, Ethan's closest friend. Daniel looked up as Ethan slid into the seat across from him. He didn't ask why Ethan was there. He never had to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The low murmur of the diner filled the silence between them, the clink of silverware, the occasional burst of laughter from another booth, the faint scratch of a radio playing some old jazz tune. Then finally, Ethan let out a slow, heavy breath. I can't do this. His voice was quiet but raw, as if he had been holding the words back for hours. I can't be her father. Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply watched Ethan, studying him with that measured, knowing gaze he always had. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists on the table. I've missed 9 years, Dan. 9 years. I didn't even know she existed until today. And now, suddenly, I'm supposed to step in and be a father? To a child who's practically a stranger to me? He shook his head, the weight of it all pressing down on him. I don't even know who she is. I don't know what she likes, what makes her laugh, what scares her. And she, his throat tightened. She doesn't know me either. Daniel took a sip of his coffee, calm as ever. Sounds like a good place to start. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It's not that simple. Daniel set his cup down. His expression softened, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of life to know better. You're right, it's not. He leaned forward slightly. But let me ask you something, Ethan. Do you really believe you have no responsibility here? The question hit harder than Ethan expected. Daniel let the silence settle, letting it sink in. Ethan shifted in his seat, his chest tightening. I didn't know, he murmured. That's not the question I asked. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. I asked if you believe you have no responsibility. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell himself that this wasn't on him, that Emily had made the decision to keep Lily a secret, that he had never been given the choice. But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was that somewhere, deep down, he knew. He had known, years ago, that Emily had been hiding something. He had seen it in her eyes, in the way she avoided certain conversations, in the way she had quietly disappeared from his life without a fight. He just hadn't pushed, hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't wanted to know. Ethan exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. What if I'm not what she needs? Daniel's gaze softened. What if you are? Ethan looked away, staring at the swirling steam rising from his untouched coffee. He had spent his entire career making decisions for other people, deciding what was right, what was fair, what was best. And yet, here he was, faced with a decision that felt impossibly large, terrifyingly personal. And he had no idea what to do. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the judge. He was just a man. A man standing at the edge of something unknown. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the courage to take the next step. Ethan had spent the night staring at the ceiling, the weight of the letter pressing against his chest even though it lay untouched on the nightstand. Sleep never came. His mind looped over the same impossible questions, over the conversation with Daniel, over the reality he still couldn't bring himself to accept. Morning arrived too soon. The world outside carried on as usual. Cars rolled down the streets, people rushed to work, life moved forward. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't sure where he belonged in it. At some point, without fully realizing how he got there, he found himself standing outside the state shelter where Lily had been placed the night before. The brick building was modest, worn at the edges, with a small playground in the back where a handful of children ran in uneven circles. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. He had been inside courtrooms, detention centers, juvenile halls, but standing here felt different. Felt heavier. He wasn't sure why he was here. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. He just knew that walking away from her yesterday had left something hollow inside him. The front desk worker gave him a curious glance but didn't ask questions. Within minutes, he was standing in a small, quiet meeting room, hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. The walls were bare, save for a faded motivational poster peeling at the edges. A stack of plastic chairs lined one corner. This wasn't a home. This was a holding space. Then the door opened. Lily stepped inside cautiously, gripping her teddy bear in one hand. She looked smaller today, or maybe it was just the dim light filtering through the narrow window. She paused when she saw him, her breath catching ever so slightly. Ethan wasn't sure what he expected. Anger, fear, hesitation, but all he saw was hope. A fragile, uncertain kind of hope, the kind that had been crushed too many times before, but still, somehow, hadn't disappeared. Hi, she said, her voice soft, almost careful. Ethan swallowed. He had never felt less prepared for a conversation in his life. Hi. His voice came out rougher than intended. Lily glanced at the empty chair across from him, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Can I sit? She asked, as if she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to. Ethan nodded. Of course. She settled into the chair across from him, hugging her teddy bear against her chest. The silence stretched between them, neither knowing how to fill it. She spoke first. I thought maybe... She hesitated, then pressed forward, voice quiet. I thought maybe you weren't coming. Ethan's throat tightened. He almost hadn't. He almost let himself believe that staying away was the easier choice. But then he thought about what Daniel had said. Do you really believe you have no responsibility here? And then he thought about the way Lily had looked at him in that courtroom, like she was waiting for something, for someone to finally choose her. I don't know what this means yet, he admitted, keeping his voice even. I don't have answers for you. Lily nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the bear's worn fabric. But I'm here, he added after a beat. I don't know much else, but I'm here. Lily's lower lip quivered just slightly, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took a shaky breath and whispered, "Okay." It was the smallest word, but somehow it felt like a beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the modest suburban house that served as Lily's new foster home. It was just another placement, just another stop in a journey with no real destination. She sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of her teddy bear. The room was neat but impersonal. Beige walls, a single dresser, a window with curtains that barely moved in the still night air. It was meant to be comfortable, but Lily had learned long ago that comfort wasn't the same as belonging. She had hoped, God, she had hoped. But Ethan Carter had come and gone. He had met her, listened to her, and then walked away without a promise. She had told herself not to expect more. But deep down, a part of her had still waited for him to come back. The social worker had said this placement was temporary, but she knew what that meant. Temporary became permanent. Permanent became forgotten. She had lived this cycle before. If Ethan didn't want her, no one else would. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she forced them down. She had learned not to cry for things she couldn't change. But this time, she could. The thought hit her like a spark in the dark. She could wait for Ethan to make a decision that might never come, or she could leave before the choice was made for her. Her heart pounded as she stood and grabbed her backpack. She didn't have much, a few clothes, her teddy bear, the letter from her mother that she kept folded in the side pocket. She wouldn't be here when morning came. She wouldn't wait to be abandoned again. The house was quiet as she crept through the hallway. The floor creaked beneath her bare feet, but no one stirred. She unlatched the front door, pulling it open just enough to slip through before easing it shut behind her. And then, she ran. The night air was cold, but she barely noticed. The streets stretched before her, unfamiliar but open. She wasn't sure where she was going, just away. Away from another rejection, away from another home that wasn't really hers. Then the first raindrop landed on her cheek, and then another. Within minutes, the drizzle turned into a downpour. Lily wrapped her arms around herself, hugging the teddy bear close, the wet fabric clinging to her skin. She kept walking, her shoes soaking through, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. The cold bit through her clothes, but she pressed on. She didn't know how long she had been walking when she finally slowed. The streets were empty, the streetlights buzzing softly. A bus stop loomed ahead, its small bench half covered in shadows. Her legs ached, her fingers numb, but she had nowhere else to go. So she sat down, tucking her knees to her chest. She shivered against the cold metal, staring out into the empty road, waiting for something, anything, to tell her what to do next. But the only thing that answered was the rain. The phone call came just after midnight. Ethan had been sitting at his desk, still in his office, staring at the unopened case files in front of him, but not really seeing them. His mind had been elsewhere, on the letter, on the little girl with wide, searching eyes, on the way she had clutched her teddy bear like it was the only thing holding her together. But then the phone rang, and the moment he answered, everything changed. "Judge Carter, this is Helen Foster. Lily Parker is missing." For a second, he couldn't process the words. His grip tightened around the phone. "What?" "She ran away from her foster home a few hours ago. No one knows where she is." His breath left him in a sharp exhale. "How long has she been gone?" "We think since late evening." The storm rolled in soon after. Ethan shot up from his chair, already reaching for his coat. Outside, rain lashed against his office window, sheets of water distorting the glow of the streetlights below. Lily was out there, alone, in this weather, a child, lost, his child. He didn't remember the drive to her foster home, only that his hands were shaking on the wheel, his heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the rain pounding against the windshield. By the time he arrived, the house was buzzing with activity. Social workers, police officers, foster parents murmuring in worry. But no one had found her. No one knew where she had gone. Something inside him snapped. He had spent years making decisions for strangers, deciding what was right, what was just. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't the judge. He was the one pleading for a second chance. And if he lost her now, he would never forgive himself. The rain didn't let up as he drove through the streets, each passing second carving deeper into his chest. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, the bus stops, the alleyways. He ran through every possibility. Where would a scared little girl go, with nowhere to belong? Would she have tried to return to the courthouse? Would she have hidden in a park? Was she huddled in a doorway somewhere, freezing in the night air? Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. What if she was hurt? What if she was afraid? What if... He forced the thought down before it could consume him. Minutes stretched into an hour, then more. His car moved slowly down an empty street, headlights slicing through the downpour. And then he saw it. A small, curled figure under the dim glow of a flickering bus stop sign. Ethan slammed the brakes. Before he could think, before he could even feel relief, he was out of the car, running. Lily sat on the cold metal bench, her knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around her drenched teddy bear. Her dress clung to her, soaked through, her curls plastered to her pale face. She wasn't moving. Ethan dropped to his knees in front of her, ignoring the rain soaking through his own clothes. "Lily?" His voice came out rough, raw, filled with something he couldn't name. Her head lifted slightly, sluggish, her eyes unfocused. She looked so small. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured, brushing a damp curl from her cheek. She was freezing. "I've got you now, okay? I've got you." Lily blinked at him, sluggish, as if she didn't quite believe he was real. Then, in a whisper so soft he almost didn't hear it, she asked, "Why did you come?" Ethan swallowed hard, something thick and painful settling in his throat. Because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Because the idea of her out here alone had terrified him more than anything ever had. Because the moment he had gotten that phone call, nothing else had mattered. His fingers curled gently around her icy hands. He had spent his whole life making decisions, but for the first time the decision had already been made. And so he said the only thing that had ever truly mattered. "Because I'm your dad." A small broken sob escaped her lips, so quiet he almost missed it. And then she collapsed against him. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, shielding her from the rain, from the cold, from the world that had failed her too many times. For the first time, he wasn't just offering his presence, he was offering himself. Ethan had never knelt for anyone, not in a courtroom, not in his personal life. He had always been the one standing, tall, firm, unshaken. A man who decided fates, who dictated order. But tonight, in the cold, rain-soaked street, he knelt before a little girl who had been waiting far too long for someone to choose her. Lily sat motionless in his arms, trembling, her soaked dress clinging to her small frame. Her curls were plastered to her pale face, her breath coming in uneven, shallow gasps. She was freezing, exhausted, defeated. But more than anything, she looked lost. Ethan's hands cradled her fragile shoulders, his thumbs brushing against her damp skin. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, of keeping emotions locked behind walls of logic and restraint. But no courtroom, no legal precedent had ever prepared him for this moment. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, full of something he couldn't bear to name, a fragile, desperate hope. Like she wanted to believe he was real, but she had learned not to trust too easily. His throat tightened. How many times had she hoped, only to be let down? He had been late, 9 years too late. His voice broke as he whispered, "I'm sorry." Lily's brows furrowed, confusion flickering in her gaze. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse hammering as he forced the words out. "I'm sorry I made you wait so long." For a second, she just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether she could believe it. And then, she broke. A small, choked sob slipped from her lips, and before Ethan could react, she collapsed against him. Her tiny hands clung to his shirt, grasping, holding, as if she was afraid that if she let go, he would disappear. The weight of her against his chest was impossibly light, but the way she clung to him felt like an entire lifetime of longing, of searching for something that had always been missing. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, his grip firm yet gentle, shielding her from the rain, from the cold, from the world that had failed her too many times. "I've got you now," he murmured, his voice thick with something he couldn't contain. "I've got you, sweetheart." And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Ethan had spent his entire career on the other side of the bench, the one making decisions, not the one begging for a chance. But today, he was not a judge. He was a father fighting for his daughter. Sitting across from Helen Foster in a dimly lit conference room, he could already tell this wouldn't be easy. The social worker's arms were crossed, her expression unreadable, but her voice was clear, firm, and unwavering. Judge Carter, with all due respect, this is not a good idea. His jaw tightened. Why? Helen let out a slow breath, measured and deliberate. Because you have no experience raising a child. Because you've spent your life in a courtroom, not in a home. Because Lily doesn't need someone who feels guilty. She needs someone who knows how to be a parent. Her words cut deep. And the worst part? She wasn't entirely wrong. He had never raised a child. He didn't know the first thing about school drop-offs, bedtime routines, or how to comfort a little girl who had spent her entire life waiting for someone to stay. But that didn't mean he was going to walk away. Because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted. Ethan knew that wanting to be a father wasn't enough, so he did what he had always done. He prepared. He met with family law attorneys, sat through hours of legal briefings, studied every requirement, every potential argument that could be used against him. He learned the system, not as a judge, but as a man desperate to hold on to the only thing that truly mattered. He underwent psychological evaluations, each session stripping away the carefully built walls of his profession, forcing him to face the reality of what being a father meant. "Do you think you're ready for this?" The evaluator asked one afternoon, her pen hovering over her notes. Ethan hesitated. He thought about Lily falling asleep on his couch, trusting him enough to let her guard down. He thought about the quiet moments, making her breakfast, brushing tangled curls from her forehead, watching her fight to believe that this time she wasn't going to be left behind. And he answered with the only truth he had. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to be." The courtroom had never felt heavier. Ethan had stood in this very spot 1,000 times before. But today, he wasn't in control. Lily sat beside him, her small fingers curled around his sleeve. Her teddy bear rested in her lap, a silent witness to everything she had endured. Across the room, Helen Foster and the state's attorney laid out their case, detailing every reason why Ethan Carter, despite his intentions, might not be the best choice. He has no experience as a parent. He's been in Lily's life for a matter of weeks. We cannot allow emotional attachment to override stability. The words hit hard, but Ethan didn't react, because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about proving that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to walk away. When it was his turn, he rose, buttoning his suit out of habit. But this time, he wasn't relying on status or reputation. He was just a man fighting for his daughter. "I won't stand here and tell you I have all the answers," he admitted. "I won't pretend I know everything about being a father." He let out a slow breath, turning slightly toward Lily. "But I know that she's spent her whole life waiting for someone to choose her. I know what it feels like when she reaches for my hand, trusting that I'll still be there. I know that when she calls me Dad, I feel it in my bones because that's who I am." His voice softened. "She is mine, and I am hers." The judge studied him, expression unreadable. Then she turned to Lily. "Miss Parker, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Lily sat up a little straighter. She didn't hesitate. "He's not just a judge." She glanced up at Ethan before turning her gaze back to the court, her voice steady. "He's my dad." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan exhaled, his hands tightening at his sides, and then after a long pause the judge spoke. "Custody is granted to Ethan Carter." For the first time since this battle began, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Beside him, Lily broke into a smile, small, hesitant, but real. She turned to him, gripping his hand with quiet certainty, and this time he gripped back, with no intention of ever letting go. The house was quiet when Ethan unlocked the door. The weight of the last few weeks still clung to him, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't coming home alone. Lily hesitated on the threshold, clutching her teddy bear. She had been in so many houses before, temporary places, temporary people. But this time, something was different. This time, someone had come back for her. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come on in, sweetheart." She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the space. It wasn't anything special. Dark wooden floors, shelves lined with books, an old leather couch that had seen better days. But then her eyes landed on something on the side table, a framed photo. Emily. She was young in the picture, smiling, her eyes full of warmth, the same eyes Lily saw in the mirror every day. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan didn't have to explain why it was there. Lily reached out, her fingers brushing over the glass. She was happy, she whispered. She was, Ethan said softly. And now he would make sure her daughter was too. Lily turned back to him, shifting on her feet. Is it okay that I'm here? Ethan's chest tightened. How many times had she been made to feel like she was just passing through someone else's life? He knelt down in front of her, steady hands resting on her arms. Lily, this is your home. You belong here. Her lower lip trembled slightly. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around him, burying her face into his shoulder. Ethan held her close, his arms wrapping around her small frame, protecting her in a way he wished he could have done since the day she was born. And then, for the first time, he said the words she had waited her whole life to hear. I love you, Lily. She stilled. For a second he wondered if he had said the wrong thing, if maybe she wasn't ready to hear it. But then she smiled. A small, soft, unmistakably real smile. And in the quietest voice she whispered, I love you too, Dad. Ethan closed his eyes, holding on to her as if the moment might slip away. But this time he wasn't letting go, because family wasn't just blood. It was the people who chose to love you. If this story touched your heart, let us know by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Every share helps spread the message that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, choice, and the people who stand by us. And if you want to hear more powerful, heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support means the world to us and keeps us inspired to bring you more stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story.